The After-Death Journal of an American Philosopher by Jane Roberts. And this is the second part of Chapter 2. And it starts out with Jane saying, I awakened groggily this morning, Wednesday, February 2nd, 1977, at 2:50 a.m., realizing that I was getting James. Lovely long sentences. I sat on the side of the bed and I took down 2 segments. After the first 2 paragraphs, I lay back down and I snuggled beneath the covers, and then the material started up again. In the morning, as I typed up what I'd written down in bed, I kept getting new interconnecting material. Obviously, I'd missed some fragments and paragraphs. As I typed, they were filled in. And then we continue here with James, William James, that is. I tried to prove the fact, the sweet products of my intuitions as they appear to my creative imagination, for such intimations of immortality did indeed carry me above my intellect's dry grounds by providing soaring concepts and emotions that freed me momentarily from my own habitual patterns of sentiment and thought. But once I tried to prove those inner intimations by evidence and deduction, once I tried to bring them into the realm of science, I began an often thankless task, for neither intuitions nor intellect were really ever satisfied. I became critical of emotional comprehensions, or rousing flights of fancy, that I knew could not be objectively proven. Where earlier I gave my imagination full sweep with no thought that such immortal urgings could have a base in fact, but kept such religious sentiments aloft from the kind of scrutiny I gave other more mundane subjects. Therefore, my poetical inner knowledge held its validity when I judged it in its own framework. But once I cast it in the light of science, the conflicts began. No longer then could I accept my intuition's comfort, for a religious or spiritual belief became only a premise in its intellectual translation, and the soul's rich drama fell apart when reassembled into the geometry of mind. For that geometry required a definite series of steps and methods before it would give up its QED to hypotheses for which the intuitions needed no such graded synthesis. Indeed, the inner structures of such intuitive securities, however strongly felt, seem to dissolve in toto. That must be an old-fashioned word. I'm not familiar with that. I guess it's short for in total. Let me start the sentence again. Indeed, the inner structures of such intuitive securities, however strongly felt, seem to dissolve in toto whenever they were tampered with intellectually, as if they were composed of the finest yet flimsiest materials, or else of ingredients solid enough in their native realms that could not, however, be transferred to the physical world. One part of me thought, of course, faith cannot stand the light of reason. The scientist must keep his beliefs separate from his world of facts and not seek to prove in the laboratory or otherwise those unprovable promptings of the soul. Let them be delegated to art or religion or philosophy, disciplines which do not have to set their theories to such rigors. On the other hand, I felt compelled to check faith's comprehensions and to bring all hidden aspects of consciousness into the democratic light of day, into the new world of progress and technology, where I hoped the Spirit's proven knowledge might then be used as an extra impetus in man's objective search for answers to reality, and also serve to temper the unscrupulous use of knowledge itself for selfish gain. For If we could mine the Earth's resources, dig deep into the planet's core, and bring forth ores and minerals, why should we not also mine the resources of the soul in like manner, bringing to the surface of men's minds those precious gems of faith and hope that lay, I thought, beneath the surface of the mind? So I began to search for such intuitive knowings and spiritual intimations, wherever they could be found, in the churches or seance rooms, the reports of dreamers seeking out the stories of respectable and eccentric alike. Yet the integrity of my own emotional comprehensions suffered, nor could I take comfort any longer from them. Moreover, my intuitions were scandalized to discover their knowledge judged by others. Moreover, my intuitions were scandalized to discover their knowledge judged by the often tawdry activities of many seance rooms, faith reduced to magicians' tricks, and husky, whispered promptings as apparitions paraded in gauzy gowns. How could man's grave and loftiest spiritual proposals come to such a fate that their validity would be considered dependent upon such maudlin sentimentality and babblings? How could those sparkling prisms of faith be turned into cheap baubles under the investigation of logic and the disciplines of control? Wednesday afternoon, February 2nd, 1977. The poet could rejoice in his intuitive revelations and give them enduring and protective clothing in his verse. Intuitions and intellect, in this case, wedded, joined in symbolic sacrament, wordless imitations fleshed out, and incandescent verse, so that the poet, like a spiritual banqueter, could have his poetic cake and eat it too. No one asks him for the recipe or ingredients, but cast the same intuitive data into the terms of usual reasoning, and the cake melts. The frosting is a gooey mess, and the impatient guest gets a mouthful of disappointment. Was faith then such a tenuous concoction that it fell at the slightest touch? Open the door to the unconscious, where the delicious loaves of inner sustenance bake, and lo and behold, we have only the cheapest of breads, soggy and unappetizing. Often I felt such to be the case, and so my melancholy grew as I examined the products said to come from that creative fire. Not until after my death did I really realize that such unconscious servings took the shape of the psyche in which they were baked, that however the ingredients were stirred or however fresh they were originally, they flowed into the contours of each individual psyche, and though like bread they might rise, so must they level out to fit the mind's container. And that container was far from pure or uncontaminated, but held also the invisible residue of all the mind's more prosaic meals, messy concoctions in which even the finest spices would be lost and overpowered. The analogy is not too far off the mark with its connotations. Hard to say. Connotations, yes, of taste and tastelessness. For even an excellent painting, gaudily framed, is the worse off. It is, perhaps, miraculous in itself that the products of the intuitions continue to manifest themselves in spite of the shoddy containers that men provide for their storage or display. I told myself that the search for extraordinary merit or revelation or evidence of man's greater validity was in its way undemocratic and cast aspersions on the common man, since nowhere in my fellows could I really perceive even a glimpse of such enduring quality, nor, when I was in such a mood, did the objective condition of the world serve to reassure me. Was I alone, then, blind to a spirituality and superior caliber constantly spoken about so glibly by others, and to which I myself gave lip service? As inconceivable as this seemed, I gave the matter considerable thought. In the world at large, in social conditions and private experience, I did recognize great energy and tried to take pleasure in the idea that I was too discriminating and disapproving, believing perhaps that the innocence of others was distorted in the light of my own melancholy, and taking comfort in the thought that excellence of mind and spirit existed, though my own temperament hid it from my eyes. So I sought to perceive, even in the shoddiest of performances, that glimpse of high-mindedness and creative virtue that must be contained within. Yet, all the while, I went dissatisfied, not realizing that only the proper blend of intuitions and intellect can provide true vision or understanding, or hope to act as a lens through which man can reflect the inner fires that provide the continuing life of the world. The creative abilities, as I know now, give the most reliable and highest evidence of those qualities that absolve man from all his own shortcomings and intrinsically lift him above even his own experience of himself into a spiritual validity that outlives his life and death alike. Such faculties represent the mental equivalent of the animal's prime innocence, and at the same time are cast in the light of God's most treasured characteristic, his creativity, from which all worlds emerge. The term God is the simplest one to use here, though it is interchangeable with many others, all referring to a point in our thinking where comprehension stops. We can no longer even mentally verbalize what we feel. The word then suggests that source out of which intuitions and intellect each spring, and in which they are so invisibly, securely, and intimately couched that they and their source are separate and united at once. These creative abilities, in their finest performances, defy time and space, lift man out of the limited context of intellect or emotion alone, and forge both into a higher faculty in which experience is more evidential than any demonstrable fact, and in which facts themselves are seen to be like wobbly weeds, stuck only momentarily in ever-shifting sands on the shores of eternity. Thursday morning, February 3rd, 1977. And Jane says here, the following material came to me just as I lay down to take a nap Wednesday afternoon. I scribbled it down at once and I typed it out Thursday morning. And here it is. I would also consider certain acts of valor and daring as creative in the highest sense, in that during such moments man transcends, first of all, imaginatively, ideas of basic limitations and goes beyond his usual experience of reality. In so doing, he actually, for that moment, creates that superior world with its observable conditions. I am referring to events where, in crisis situations, the body performs in ways that, momentarily at least, contradict known individual or mass beliefs about its limits and possible achievements. When it outdoes itself and hence, through its performance, breaks old records that were earlier held up as representing the ultimate possible in bodily achievement. Such acts take place first in the imagination, in bursts of corporeal insight that can strike with the same force as any revelation, and under that sudden impetus of mind, the body miraculously responds and brings to the physical arena a new idea of what is practical or possible. It is the tension between the search for fulfillment or perfection and the actual performance possible in the physical world that promotes creative acts as they are understood. For true creativity always destroys limitations and increases the mental, spiritual, psychic, or physical areas of expression open to man. The Greek conception of the fit mind in the fit body is important in this context, yet that ideal finally disintegrated into a futile search for a dreary, stereotyped mental and physical perfection whose mottled edges blurred the vitality of any individual variances. I see, however, how these principles can, in an altered fashion, be applied to a modern democratic society while retaining their original insistence upon high aspiration and individual fulfillment. And then Jane says, this would be Jane Roberts, I typed this material and then I got up, heated some water for instant coffee, and washed the dishes while I waited. I stood at the sink doing these chores, and suddenly a whole burst of James material came into my mind in a circular fashion difficult to describe, so I rushed back to the typewriter to record the following. In some dreams, inspirations, and revelations, in the performance of artistic pursuits and some athletic achievements as well, man then displays abilities that are record-breaking, that set new standards and destroy past limitations, either of mind or body, and therefore bring into conscious awareness new areas of action, contemplation, and creativity. Dreams or flashes of telepathic insight can also momentarily destroy the usual barriers that separate one mind from another and make mockery of science's concepts concerning space, time, and the nature of the species. Such incidents suggest the immortal existence of at least some portion of man's consciousness by displaying those characteristics and abilities that show his knowledge not to be bound by the laws that before had seemed to restrict him. I prefer to list all such activities, paranormal or not, under the heading of high creative acts, for each one is creative in that it opens new areas of action or thought and expands man's capacity to think or behave in new fashions. Beginning in my time and continuing in yours, however, certain misconceptions on the part of psychology have grossly diminished man's opportunities for expression and creativity by handing down average standards that supposedly govern individual behavior, beyond which the normal person is not to venture, beyond which the normal person is not to venture. Hence, in my time, the birth of parapsychology came as a new artificial division to include activities not of a normal nature, a container for all those experiences that did not fit into the original cramped tenets adopted as the sum of man's psychological reality. Freud's European background and America's experiment with democracy were each partially responsible for these misconceptions and their unfortunate results. In a democracy without a rigid authoritarian government, in a political structure in which the individual is given greater free play, inner authoritative measures are taken to protect the society against what it considers the very dangers of individual action that its constitution says it wants to promote. Psychology was initiated when the new society was trying its wings, and its father, Freud, with his authoritative heritage, symbolized for America its own position. It must remain it must maintain clear conscious lines of action while trying to give vent to all the unconscious, primitive drives in such a way that they were released, but not allowed to damage normal life. The individual must be taught that his deepest drives were suspect, so that self-discipline could replace authoritative okay, I got it. Authoritative government. Okay, let me read that sentence again. The individual must be taught that his deepest drives were suspect, so that self-discipline could replace authoritative government. Certain feelings, actions, and attitudes were considered normal, and others not. The individual was given a book of rules to follow from birth to grave, in which the unconscious replaced both the devil and harsh government, forcing obedience through fear of the natural self. Such standardization was then promptly applied to the democracy's unhomogeneous citizens. The Italians, the English, Irish, Spanish, Dutch, men and women of all racial heritage were therefore expected to follow individual norms that would allow the person a political and social freedom that he would be psychologically unable to misuse. In this hodgepodge, inner restraints would serve to replace a paternal government. Adventuresomeness, creativity, and energy would all be directed toward the collective goals of society, toward physical triumph over the land and industrial achievement. All was an attempt to use and yet curb the fantastic energy of a people who came from every conceivable background and national heritage. The inner life of the American individual became standardized, however, stripped of religion's old rich symbolisms, yet given no new ones. Constructively speaking, Freud translated religion's demons into the instinctive impulses, retaining these while throwing aside the grander symbols of a heroic and authoritative God. Precisely because of his own experience, Freud then sometimes felt unendurable upswings of intuition and telepathic data, surges of creativity, and the deepest undisciplined emotional conditions. These only intensified his certainty that the inner life of man was dangerous and that he was doomed by his own early heritage. Freud perceived and experienced the creative force as primarily sexual in nature in a broader way than usually supposed, but also in a Germanic sense of the word, a sexuality that was deeply and darkly passionate, with overtones of surrender or triumph, and with further implications of conflict and warfare. His psychology standardized and explained the feelings of men and women in a way that left them no individual interpretations of their own that mattered. Psychoanalysts could come up with individual personal episodes of the most intimate nature, but these were in response to an explanation already given, in which individual feeling existed on a standardized basis. Again, creative acts are non-standard. They break records. They are not predictable. Creativity then became suspect. Freud tried to tie it to man's most frightening fears, to chain it to repressions rather than to aspirations or fulfillment. Those characteristics promoting creativity were suspect, non-standard, and the very ones to be exercised. Intuitional insights were then assigned to hysterical behavior, but hysterical by whose standards? The devotion to contemplation or solitary thought, or to the arts, particularly for a male, became most suspect of all, and those who did not channel their creative drives toward the democratic society's safe, materialistic goals felt that society's wrath. Against this background, do-it-yourself seances sprang up throughout the country, along with religious societies and varied pseudo-religions. Christian Science, in particular, tried to right the balance by applying positive thinking with as heavy hand as Freud had applied repression. The people felt that it was safest not to explore the subconscious described by Freud, and indeed, the common man could not afford to do so. He was effectively left with a psychological hell instead of a theological one, minus a compensating heaven, and made afraid of the very creative abilities that would have been able to release him and society. There were some counter tendencies, as with transcendentalism, but these were not the meat of the common man, but of the intellectuals. The creative abilities are common in mankind, but uncommon in their individual expression, bringing out distinctions and patterns that extend the capabilities of individual action and achievement. When an individual acts most like himself, most individualistically, and least like others, he displays creative behavior and points out to others possibilities of achievement earlier not perceived, throwing these out as new aspirations for the individual and society. I hope to show that these abilities must be encouraged by any democratic nation that wishes to survive as such. First, an examination of the creative faculties is in order, and again I refer to the creative act as including telepathic and clairvoyant performance, which I see as an extension of normal creativity, considered paranormal only because of the standardization applied within psychology itself. What characteristics or conditions promote creativity? And how does creative action contribute to the vitality of social order? Well, that concludes Chapter 2. Chapter 3 is entitled Freud, Jung, and Protestantism. Wow, this is certainly a very interesting book and gives us a totally different view of things. I hope you're enjoying it, and till soon.